What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the classroom. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to just find the difference quotient of a rational function. Move my head a little bit. So if you have questions throughout, please let me know. But let's go ahead and get started. Let's say let f of x equal x over x minus 1. We want to find the difference quotient, which, if you remember, is f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. All right, so what we want to do is recall what this notation here means. Okay, this f of x plus h, remember what that means to do. That means everywhere we see an x in our function, we want to substitute the expression x plus h. So let's go ahead and take care of that. We're going to try to color code everything. So in red, we're going to take care of the f of x plus h portion of the difference quotient. All right, so I see an x here, and I see an x right there. So for both of those x's, make sure you plug in x plus h for both of those x values. So in my numerator, I'll have x plus h. In my denominator, I'll have x plus h minus 1. So there is the f of x plus h part. Next, in blue, we want to subtract f of x. So f of x is simply the function that we begin with. So we want to subtract that function in its entirety, okay? So minus x over x minus 1. So that is the function. We need to subtract that function. And then in black, we're going to just keep all this over h. So the red corresponds to the f of x plus h part. The blue corresponds to the minus f of x part. And then all of that is over h. All right, so let's review something real quick. I always like to review adding and subtracting fractions whenever I'm teaching this lesson, because you can make the relationship between a simple adding or subtracting fraction problem, you can make that relationship between that and this. And so what I mean by that is, if I want to say take 1/2 and subtract 1/3 from 1/2, what you need to do whenever you're subtracting or adding fractions is you have to put them on the same playing field. That's the way I like to think about it. Okay, so what I mean by that is they need the same denominator. You cannot add or subtract fractions when they do not have the same denominator. And therefore, when we look at 1/2 and 1/3, we have a denominator 2 and we have a denominator 3. So what we need to do is think of something called a least common denominator, or at least a common denominator. All right. So in this case, the least common denominator could be found relatively quickly by just taking the two denominators and multiply them together. Okay. So 2 times 3 is 6. So what the least common denominator tells us is 2 can divide evenly into 6. 3 can divide evenly into 6. Okay, so both of our denominators are factors of our least common denominator. So now what we need to do is think to ourselves, okay, I need to make both of these have a denominator 6. Well, in order to make 1/2 have a denominator 6, what I want to do is multiply the top and bottom by 3. Okay, you have to make sure you multiply the top and bottom by 3 because, well, when you multiply the top and the bottom by 3, you're not changing the value of the fraction. So when I multiply 3 times 1, I get 3. 3 times 2, I get 6. 3 over 6 is 1/2. So basically, I've just taken 1/2 and rewritten it as 3 over 6, which is important because now when I go to the second fraction, what do I have to do to 3 to make it 6? Well, I have to multiply it by 2. Make sure you do it to the top and the bottom, and then you'll have minus 2 over 6. Now notice they have the same denominator, and therefore I can just simply subtract the numerators. 3 minus 2 is 1. And then the common denominator, of course, is 6. So 1/2 minus 1/3 is 1/6. Now, why do I like to review it this way? Well, if you look at how I wrote the LCD first, I wrote it as 2 times 3. So the reason I like to write it as 2 times 3 is because that tells me over here I need to make sure I multiply the 3 times 2 and then the 2 times 3. So notice both of those look like that. Okay? So now let's keep that idea in mind as we do the rest of this difference quotient. Well, look at the top here. Okay, let's not worry about the h right now. Let's look at the top. We have the red fraction and the blue fraction being subtracted. So we have 2 fractions being subtracted, just like we did over here in this review. Okay, so what we need to do is have a common denominator, which this is a factor and this is a factor. Okay, so those two must be factors of the common denominator. Well, the LCD here is simply going to be x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. It's very similar to how we determined the LCD in the previous problem where we reviewed. Okay, the LCD between 2 and 3, well, you can find that easily by just taking 2 and multiplying it by 3. It's 6, right? 2 and 3 are both factors of 6. Okay, so I will use a similar method and I would find the LCD here. Okay, so now let's continue on just like we did in the little review problem. I need to take this denominator and multiply it by something to make it the common denominator. Well, what is that something? Well, if you look very closely, this denominator has this part of the common denominator is missing the x minus 1. So we need to multiply the top and the bottom by x minus 1. Let's put that x plus h in parentheses. Okay, so now go over to the second fraction. Well, the second fraction has the x minus 1 part of the common denominator. So to make it the common denominator, we need to multiply by x plus h minus 1. Okay, so I know there's a lot of colors on the screen. I hope the colors are helping. Let me know in the comments if you like the colors or if you don't like the colors. All right, so let's clean this up a little bit. So now what do I have? Well, I have a common denominator. Let's go ahead and put h in my denominator of the difference quotient. Now the 2 fractions that I'm trying to subtract have a common denominator of x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. What did I have to do to the first fraction? Well, I had to multiply it by x minus 1. So let's just bring that down and then we'll take care of the algebra. Okay, the second fraction I had to multiply by x plus h minus 1. So now we just have a bunch of algebra to take care of, some reducing, and we'll be right where we want to be. All right, so remember, when you have binomials multiply together, you need to FOIL, okay? So when I FOIL, remember, FOIL is first, outer, inner, last. So we want to take the 2 first terms, which are both x's, multiply those together. That's x squared. Outer, x times h, is xh. Inner, negative 1 times x is negative x. And then last, negative 1 times h is minus h. Okay. Now we want to scoot along over to this portion. And we need to distribute this negative x. All right, so when I distribute that negative x, I'll have negative x squared minus xh plus x. And then all that has the common denominator of x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. And then remember, though, this is still all over h. And what I'm going to do is treat that h as a fraction and say h over 1. All right, and you'll see why I do that in just a second. Now, if you notice, there's a lot of common terms in the numerator. In the numerator of the numerator, right? In the orange and blue part. There are a lot of common terms that I could reduce. Well, let's circle some common terms here. I have x squared and negative x squared. Well, guess what? They reduce to 0. I have positive xh, negative xh. They both reduce down to 0. And then I have a negative x and a positive x. Well, what do you know? They reduce down to 0. So all that's left up there, out of all that work, the only thing that's left is a negative h. So I'll have negative h over x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. And then again, all that is over h over 1. Okay? Now, bear with me, okay? So that's subtracting fractions. We just reviewed adding and subtracting fractions. The method is similar if you're adding fractions. In this case, we were subtracting. Now we want to review dividing fractions, right? When you divide fractions, remember what you do is you take the first fraction and you multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. I like to use a phrase called copy, change, flip. So this top fraction right here is what we're going to copy. So copy. So what I mean by that is, well, let's put an equal sign. We're going to just copy it the way we see it. So negative h over x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. And then change. What that means to do is, that means to take the division symbol right here and change it to multiplication. So we're going to change that to multiplication. And then flip simply means to take this fraction and flip it. So essentially we're multiplying by the reciprocal. So when I flip h over 1, I get 1 over h. Oh, my head's in the way. Okay, so let's go down on the screen and let's finish this out. Well, now when you multiply fractions, look to see if there's any common terms in the numerator and denominator. Well, we clearly see there's an h in the numerator here. There's an h in the denominator of this fraction. They reduce to 1. So they reduce with each other. I still have a negative in my numerator. And so negative 1 times 1 would be negative 1. And then in my denominator, I have x plus h minus 1 times x minus 1. That is the difference quotient to my function x over x minus 1. Okay? I hope this video helped. I'm about to make a video of finding the difference quotient for a radical function, so look for that soon. Until then, be safe. Oh, and come back to the classroom.